Welcome to the Wilson Center. I am Sue Levenstein of the Asia program. Our program today is Legitimizing the Illegitimate, Burma's Political Dilemmas. This event is a follow-up event to our March 26th conference that was focusing on Burma's economic problems. And today, in turn, we will focus more on Burma's current political situation. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce our first speaker today, Professor Mary Callahan. She's from University of Washington, and she teaches courses on Southeast Asian politics, international political economy, humanitarian affairs, human rights, and exile politics. Her recent publication is Making Enemies, War and State Building in Burma, and Political Authority in Burma's Ethnic Minority States. And we are very, very happy to have here today to talk to us about the Tat Madal.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I should say from the start that my first job out of PhD school was at the Naval Postgraduate School, where I learned that nothing we're saying could be said without PowerPoint. And as it turns out, the US military doesn't think that anymore, and perhaps it's PowerPoint that is causing us to lose wars. But I do have some images I'd like to share with you, and so I'll try not to dumb it down, as General Petraeus has warned us against. Okay, so my task today, I was asked to explain the endurance of military rule in Burma or Myanmar. And I actually would like to challenge the question on this. I'd like to ask the question of why wouldn't the military endure in rule in Burma? And much of what I've written over the last 20 years has, in one way or another, been trying to come up with answers to this question. Given that no one inside or outside Burma, probably including General Than Shwe, the head of the regime today, or the former dictator General Ne Win, would have imagined that the September 1988 coup group and its heirs would still be running the country 22 years later, I think we've been asking the wrong questions for a very long time. Our assumption in just asking that question is that military rule, as if by ontological necessity, will disappear in the post-Cold War era. I want to ask, why would we assume that the Burmese military would step out of power? Why do we think that it would capitulate in the face of external pressures? Why would anyone expect that withholding U.S. investments in Burma would strengthen the hand of Burma's liberal-minded elements, including any who may have at one time been in senior positions but no longer are? And why do we think that some kind of Lafayette-style solution will end the political deadlock? Something like sending a UN envoy, a member of Congress, or some enlightened Southeast Asian general who has seen the democratic light to advise the generals on how to run their country. And how exactly would a democratic opposition, or actually I would encourage us to start using the plural, democratic oppositions, bring down the regime? The truth is that the more you study Burma and the more time you spend inside the country, the less that you know and even less that you can talk about. We have made so many assumptions and inferences based on a very small range of data points, of evidence, that some 22 years later, we have never gone back and questioned the assumptions and the logic of those inferences. So today, what I would like to do, in the paper that I'm writing for the Woodrow Wilson Center, I'm trying to break down many of those assumptions and inferences. And in the paper, I'll venture a guess at why we've gotten things so wrong. And part of it has to do with the ethics of scholarship on Burma and reporting. Those of us who spend time inside of Burma, and by us, I mean scholars in general, international NGO workers, etc., we see that there is enormous dynamism in state and society, especially on the society side. But coming out and writing about, for example, clever NGO activities that in fact democratize local administration, if we come out and write about that, then we put those very liberal forces on the radar screen, not simply of a repressive military, but also another truth regime-laden institution, that of the media on the outside. And as a result, the predominant voices that frame the debate on Burma are hardliners on both sides. And here you can see the hardliners on the regime side. The people's desire is an ever-present billboard you see all over the place. The regime still sounds very Maoist, and I actually think part of the problems in the economy is they are still very Maoist. But it's clearly this feels anachronistic. Oppose those relying on external elements, acting as stooges and holding negative views. I think there's a second truth regime that takes the same data points and sometimes even arrives at the same conclusions. Hardliners on both sides of the debate, both within the regime, interpreting every action of exiles, of pro-democracy forces as dangerous, and much of the media on the outside interpreting every data point we get on the regime as necessarily evidence of historical anachronism, of military evil, etc. And I think this matters right now with the Obama administration currently talking about dialogue with Naypyidaw. Because on Capitol Hill, there really are only two deliverables, that are acceptable. And that's that Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD have a clear role in a future democratic Burma, and that all political prisoners be released. And that, to the regime, is a very hardline position. Okay, so over the years, we've gotten an awful lot of things wrong. And today, I just want to go over some of these in brief. The first is that we tend to assume, or we tend to conclude, actually, that the regime is afraid. Every time I come to Washington, I'm amazed by how many people tell me that the regime is afraid. They're afraid of their own people. They're afraid of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, the US, the ILO. Maybe, but I'd like to suggest that we look at those data points a little differently. Secondly, that the next generation of officers is inevitably going to be more liberal. That if we can just get rid of the top zealots, then the future looks good. Third, we tend to, in policy formation, assume that the military is on the brink of an implosion or an explosion, collapse, reform. And then, counterintuitively, we also tend to, and actually maybe it connects, we also tend to assume that General Thanchui is in control of everything in Burma. I would like to examine the assumptions behind most of these characterizations and talk about their implications for the coming elections. So one of our assumptions is that the military fears Aung San Suu Kyi and their own people and everybody on the outside. And this seems self-evident to us. Any rational actor behaving as it has done and receiving the kinds of sanctions it has received should be ashamed, right? It should feel cornered. And yet, I actually think this cartoon by Han Lei, who's a brilliant cartoonist, maybe gets it a little more right, or at least raises a question. We don't know that the number one thing on the regime's agenda every single day is Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, and their ideas about political reconciliation. it's unlikely that everything they've done over the last 22 years has been done with them in mind. And this shows up all the time, this notion that the regime is afraid. This is just from yesterday's Irrawaddy online edition. Senior General Than Shwe is a worried man. He's called for an election which will change the course of the nation's history. It's true, he has something to be worried about. No leader of Burma has ever left power gracefully or left power alive, free, or with his family's finances intact. So he does have something to be worried about. I'm sure the officer corps in general is worried. But you know what? I come from a military family, and I know most senior generals don't really question themselves very often. Junior officers don't tend to tell senior officers that they're wrong. Moreover, this interpretation, a set of assumptions about fear, suggests that there's only one explanation that for good behavior by the regime. And mind you, the regime has done some things right. It finally responded after years of pressure to some of the ILO requirements on forced labor. Did it do it because it was afraid of the ILO? Possibly. But it also could be that the two ILO representatives in Burma, or Myanmar, have spent years trying to figure out the right people to talk to and the right language to use. Trafficking, human trafficking. The regime has actually, in general, cooperated with the UN body that deals with trafficking. Isn't it also possible to see that a proud nationalist army would prefer not to see their people trafficked? Another example on HIV/AIDS. This is kind of a remarkable thing, that the regime has essentially allowed international aid donors to create a parallel state. The international aid that has gone in the FAM and the 3D Diseases Fund cannot go through the government. And so it goes all through NGOs, essentially creating a parallel system of service delivery. Is it possible they did it out of fear? Possibly. But I think it's also likely that there were moments of opportunity where both locals and international organizations seized them. Moreover, I'm not convinced that they act out of fear very often. In their minds, they have already achieved national reconsolidation. This is the billboard that's on the way to the airport as you come out of Rangoon, or you head to the airport, and it says, towards a modern developed country, and it turns out you're going to the airport to leave Myanmar. And I had to take the picture quickly, because you can't take photos around the airport. And I should also point out that yesterday at Annapolis Mall, I was almost arrested for taking a photo of a little pet for sale there. So, you know, again, a data point that you have to be careful taking pictures in Burma. It turns out here, too. In the regime's mind, they have achieved reconsolidation. They've stopped the wars, at least temporarily, in most of the ethnic nationality areas. And they have produced a constitution. This is the billboard for the Amyuda Nilagan, which was the national convention that produced it. Now, we are so pleased when we hear Aung San Suu Kyi, for example, in her kangaroo court trial a year and a half ago, say, when she had a brief opportunity to talk to the diplomats, that she still thinks there's a chance for national reconciliation. And that sounds very good to us. But to the regime, national reconciliation isn't relevant. National reconsolidation is. And they've achieved it. Second, this photo doesn't really go with the point here, but I just wanted to put it up there because I took it in the Armed Forces Museum, and I've never been able to use it in a show before. So we tend to assume that in the future, reformist officers are going to come along, and there's some evidence for this. Just, you know, logistically, right now, the brigadier generals were classmates with the 88 protesters. I mean, that's where they have come from. So they've all All those who are on a fast track have already graduated from the National Defense College. They're still friends with those who are still inside, maybe gone into business or NGO work. They probably talk to each other. They also, when they were in Rangoon, played a lot of golf. So the military attachés that are based in Rangoon had a chance to talk to them. But I don't think that we can assume that they are going to be pro Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD as a solution for reconciliation. She may never have criticized the Army directly, but after 20 years asking young military officers, we're asking them to split hairs here. All of Aung San Suu Kyi's backers have criticized the Army directly. And the regime's line is that all of Burma's problems are a result of Western pressure. And if you're a young officer and you just look at the history of the last 22 years, every liberal 1, 2, and 3-star general, most of the ones who actually spoke any English, have all been pushed out. So I am not convinced. I don't see any real evidence of this. We have a few data points, as I said, I mean, just the age and the common networks. But I would actually like some real evidence of this. And I put this up. This runs in the newspaper every single day, the number of casualties of Iraqi people. It runs in both the Myanmar and the English version. And it also runs in a number of private publications. So if you're a colonel in the Tomato, the Burmese Armed Forces, you've seen Burma's treatment by the U.S. The U.S. that has caused enormous suffering, in their view, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, the next assumption is that the military is on the brink of crisis. It's in the penultimate chapter of an inevitable process toward liberal reform, and it just needs one more push. It is true that Burma, like Thailand, arguably Indonesia and the Philippines, arguably Malaysia, they are all in the throes of a succession crisis. And in the Tomato, what we really don't know is what happens to the regional command structure under the new constitution. Nobody has any evidence on that. At this point, regional and territorial commanders act as political and economic chiefs in their region, and they're going to be replaced by executive and legislative bodies. Whether they have any power or not, I'm not sure. And a lot of the evidence for this comes from exiles and defectors from the Army, and they are great sources of information. But they're not the only sources. This is my image for the military cracking. And so there are three inferences that we make without ever reflecting on them. First is that the factional struggles inside the military, frequently characterized as softliners versus hardliners, are going to tear it apart. They just need to be pushed a little further to ignite, to put targets on the back of the most corrupt and the most anti-democratic generals. But isn't it also possible that factionalism could play into the hands of the most anti-democratic? Certainly when Western countries demand only two deliverables, either respecting the 90 election or suing the NLD in the future elections, and political prisoners, there's no wiggle room for any liberals in the military officer corps. And so I think these factional struggles are way overstated. No Southeast Asian military stays together in the way this one has under crisis. I mean, 7 years ago, it dismantled military intelligence, which up to that point we assumed was running the whole country, without a peep. No problems at all. I can't imagine that in Thailand, for example. Number two, and I'm guilty of this. And in fact, I'm guilty of almost all of these. So I'm Catholic, so you should know that. Number two, in terms of the military on the brink, is that it's facing a logistical nightmare. It grew from 180,000 to maybe 350,000 in the first 5 years of the regime. Feeding, funding, supplying, recruiting is impossible at this point. That is true, but I would also say that one set of data points we haven't paid a lot of attention to, Andrew South and Myo have, is that the command structure has actually evolved in a way that the logistics they're really improving. And the third thing about the military on the brink is that it faces very low morale. Battalion strengths are low, and there's good evidence for this. I traveled around in Kachin State and Shan State 3 years ago, and I saw battalions which were supposed to be a strength of 770 that the locals said were lucky if they had 100 soldiers in them. But isn't it also possible that the military, in terms of its size, is reaching an equilibrium point? Isn't it also possible that the numbers, 400,000, as suggested by lots of observers on paper, it may be 400,000. But, you know, maybe the Moma Tomato is turning into the right size military for its country. And maybe the dependence of local commanders on local economies is not just a one-way relationship, a relationship of seizure and exploitation. If you look at the territorial structure of New Order Indonesia's army, in fact, there was a system called kekaryaan, in which local commanders received their last posting in a region where they had to make nice with local businesses because their pension wasn't going to pay for them to survive, and so they actually had to create a space for themselves in a civilian economy. And so for these three sets of assumptions that we actually treat as conclusions, I would just remind you that no other Southeast Asian military has survived as many purges intact. I actually think purges work great for this military. They're a form of fundraising, and I can explain that later. Most claims of penultimacy, that's not a word, but I think it should be, are made by observers who probably dismiss them in private. Most of those who are arguing that the Tomato is on the brink, for example, at Exile Media, will say to you, of course they're not on the brink, but we have to say this. And actually, many academics come out, and what they report on what's going on in Burma, we self-censor because we don't want to put people at risk. One assumption is that the General Than Shwe, this is Han Lei again, and the caption was, "It's just not fair, it's always his move." That's Than Shwe back there. One of the things that we tend to assume is the military is in total control. It's running the country straightforwardly to what it's had in mind. Than Shwe's masterminded everything. He's a psychological warfare officer. We also have concluded, again, kind of contradictorily, that Than Shwe is totally isolated, that he has no consultations with anyone whatsoever. Or we conclude that he's at the beck and call of Chinese investors or his cronies, Teza. I think it's possible that it's a much more complicated relationship. I doubt that any Burmese military leaders of this generation or future generations is at the beck and call of anybody from China. And I also think that the relationship between the cronies and the regime is evolving, and it's far more complicated. The roadmap, as an example, that wasn't what Than Shwe came to power promising. He did promise a new constitution when he took power from Senior General Somong. But the roadmap was made up by General Kim Yun in hindsight, 7 or 8 years ago. And so you look at it, and there's a bunch of steps in there that all sound like the same thing, and I think it's kind of made up on the fly. And honestly, I don't see it as something that was terribly well thought out, much like changing the name of the country. I think it's, again, more complicated. The regime, for one thing, at this point, has, over the last 2 years, been raising many, and we don't have data on how many, but especially in the ethnic nationality states, many new militia. Burmese military regimes do this about every 15 or 20 years. They arm local populations. They deal with whatever the threat was that made them arm the local populations, and then they can't control the militia. They've never successfully disarmed on a large scale these militia. So this is Faraya, who's a Shan cartoonist. And I put this up here because there are so many militaries in Burma. There are these pro-junta nationality militia, which have never, as I said before, been successfully controlled. There's the Swun Ashin, this shadowy group of thugs associated with the 2007 crackdown. There's civilians. Most people who work for the government have to go to people's defense training. Now, it's possible that generals delude themselves into thinking that their message is being absorbed and that people will practice loyalty. But I actually think their harshness alone suggests that they are not entirely sure. Some other armies. Many of the former ceasefire groups or groups that surrendered have, since 2005, this is nothing new, been told they have to form border guard forces. The biggest ones have balked at it, but this is every day in the newspaper. There's a report of one new border guard force being formed. Another set of militaries. And we don't really know how some of these ceasefire armies, the WA, are said to have between 15 and 20,000, for example, under arms. I'm not sure about any numbers in Burma. We really don't know what's going to happen with them. The WA and the SPDC's negotiations broke down a few weeks ago, and there's no indication they're going back to the table. They are still discussing with the Kachin Independence Army, but I think politically it'll be very difficult for the KIA to lay down weapons. Even an army that we have long thought was a puppet of the regime, the Democratic Karen Buddhist Army, has balked at becoming a border guard force. This was something that seems highly improbable. This is a map from a couple of years ago. Oddly enough, it's on a Chinese tourism site. You can never figure out where the original things are. That shows all of the different places that there are armed groups in northeastern Burma. So there are ceasefire groups that are there. Many of them are splitting into new forces over the question of border guard forces. There are also still armed anti-state forces, the KNU, the Shan State Army South. And there are also armed humanitarian groups that traffic back and forth across the border from Thailand. In most of these places where you see the multicolored armed groups, the population is extremely poor. Their livelihoods, for example, this is an image from Pierre Arnaud Chauvy in 2004 from Wa region, Special Region 1. And the population there goes 4 to 6 months without any food security. These populations are very poor, and they are likely at this point, some 20 years after ceasefires, to be more anti-ceasefire group leaders than they are anti-SPDC. And probably few of them would be pro-NLD, would be my guess. Final set of assumptions is that this is one of the many signboards. This is in Pa'an, I took about 5 years ago. Is that the regime is anachronistic, it's psychopathological, the military leaders are crazy, stupid, xenophobic, venal, they're a pathogen to be cured by society. I think that, Fukuyama himself finally abandoned the end of history idea, but we are still carrying these assumptions around with us. we just look next door at Thailand, and we can see that militaries in Southeast Asia are in politics. There's no inevitability that they go back to the barracks and stay there. The new president in the Philippines, Noynoy, it's very likely the armed forces of the Philippines are going to flourish under a very inexperienced president. And they may not necessarily be psychopaths either. The Burmese military has some good reasons to view Western governments, citizens, and exiles based in the West as threats. In living memory, Andrew Self recently wrote a very interesting working paper called Even the Paranoid Have Enemies. He points out that there have been 3 foreign invasions in living memory. There have been at least 6 stronger powers, including the United States and China, that have supported armed anti-state activity in the past, the kind of armed anti-state activity that left many members of the Tamara dead. Moreover, the U.S. claimed credit for all of the monk protests in 2007, something that was backed up by George Packer in his very skewed New Yorker article. So I don't think that we should be looking at the Moma Tomato as some weird, evil ghost of the past. I think that we should be questioning all of those assumptions and the data points that come out in terms of mostly anecdotal evidence. So what does this rethinking of the Tamara tell us about the coming elections? This is a picture I took in Taunji on the right of the USDA's headquarters, looks a lot like a bank. And across the street from it is one of the many signboards exhorting people to obey the law and trust that the Tamara is the fatherland, or protects the fatherland and the motherland. As we look at the elections, we know some, and I think Minsin will talk more about oppositions, but I want to suggest that we also do not write off some of the organizations and institutions that we think are completely controlled by the military. For example, we are all assuming that the military will, that the regime will run candidates under the USDA, this corporate organization it formed, and the National Unity Party, which it formed for the 1990 elections. In areas such as, for example, in northern Shan State, these are areas, and Kachin State, these are areas where land grabs are ongoing at unprecedented levels. There is evidence that either the Yunnanese government or the Chinese government in Beijing is providing incentives to Yunnanese companies to go into Burma and strip land away from farmers and build plantations. In those areas, local leaders, and by these I don't mean government leaders, I mean leaders of communities, organic communities, are actually talking about running under the banner of the USDA or its party or the NUP. They feel like they can work inside that institution to start providing protections to foreigners. And yet our media is telling us that these elections, fraudulent or flawed as the election laws and the Constitution are, will inevitably have only one outcome. This is from this month's Irrawaddy magazine. Naypyidaw will become a fortress of ambitious new parliamentarians and military old guard. Okay, so it's going to be elites who manage to capture office. But you know what? It may also be some elites that want to push the military, at least in the direction of the barracks. It is the case that in parts of Burma, particularly the ethnic nationality areas, that walking away from this election seems like a much bigger threat than being part of it. So finally, on legitimacy, and this is it, I'm shutting down. There really are 2 methods of change that are going to happen in Burma. And we tend to assume that that legitimacy is also a kind of ontological necessity for rule in the 21st century. I would like to say that it is neither an equilibrium state nor a teleological likelihood. Everyday politics in Burma involves a complex array of actors that are setting up many different kinds of institutions that really are functioning parallel to the military and the government. People working from within are often mocked in the media outside. And that often puts them back on the radar screen of the regime. If somebody from inside criticizes the NLD, the assumption is they're anti-democratic. And I want to suggest that your takeaway, maybe this leads in nicely to minsin, is that there are many Democrats who are not NLD in Burma. This is much like our unexamined assumptions about the military. These are the idea that the National League for Democracy embodied the democratic movement in Burma was absolutely accurate in 1990. And it's horrible that they've ever been allowed to assume office. But in a country with over 100 different ethnic groups, in a country where there is actually, it's a censored but a flourishing press, there are many different people who have chosen the first path to try to work from within. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for your very compelling presentation. Our next speaker is minsin. He is currently studying at UC Berkeley and is also teaching there. And he is a former student leader who worked closely with Aung San Suu Kyi during the 1988 pro-democracy movement. And minsin is here to speak to us about Burma's opposition parties and their relevancy to the current election.
Oh, I am? Sorry. I thought you were talking to him. Should I sit down there?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I was asked to do a presentation about the opposition movements in Burma and the question of relevancy. Since independence, Burmese polity has been fraught with the different kinds of contentious politics. I mean, we can range spectrum from armed insurgency to nonviolent movement against state. History of Burmese politics, opposition movement, could be understood at least in 5 different forms of struggle. I try to make it simple by categorizing in 5 ways. Legal political means, arms insurgency, underground, we call it UG in Burma, clandestine activities, and above ground is broadly speaking like civil society groups and like domestic media, and the international advocacy, lobby, grassroots, and etc. In this presentation, I'll examine how the opposition movement since 1988 have played out up to now, and whether they're going to remain relevant in post-2010. If they do, how so? So the first question must be asked, what is relevancy? There are 2 ways to look at relevancy. The first way is in terms of outcome, in terms of likelihood of accomplishing the professed goal. And the second one is, because when we talk about the opposition movement, which claim to represent the public, so we need to talk about the morality of intention too. So we need to give consideration of the moral issue. In a way, public support and legitimacy play a key role in determining the relevancy. So I'll look at from both views. Like one is in terms of public support, legitimacy. The other one is in terms of outcome. So I just made a frame of analysis to explain these issues. First, I will look into the political environment on the left side. You will see this is the public support and legitimacy. In a way, this is a contextual setting. The political environment that allows opposition to be able to rally the public support behind them and gain legitimacy. Because of these factors, the opposition managed to rally the public support and legitimacy. In this box, I will look at the nature of state and its relation to the society. And the other one is I'll probably touch upon the well-known concept in the Western literature, like the political opportunity structure. But I will try to argue that we need to distinguish between the political opportunity structures and then the strategic opening in Burma context. So these are the factors I will detail later on that accompany with the opposition, like commitment, courage, and sacrifice, together make the opposition to rally the public support behind them. And that's how they remain relevant in terms of legitimacy. Then I'll look into the outcome, so which is I call a parameter for the outcome that could allow the opposition movement to increase likelihood of accomplishing their goals. Within the parameter, I will employ the card-stroke concept of resilience and leverage and my own writings with regard to endgame strategy. In each item, I'll break down, for example, like resilience. Resilience is not just about psychological factors like endurance and commitment. It's all about also the repertoire and the mobilization structures. And also leverage is also about like tactical innovation and the media accessibility and third party and all this stuff. So at the end, I will talk about the end game strategy. In this regard, I will examine the need for the filling the power vacuum whenever like the public uprising or any confrontation take place in Burma, whether Burmese opposition managed to fill the power vacuum, and also whether they could manage to balance between interest-based approach and right-based approach. So these are the brief. I'll go into detail. First of all, we need to explain about the nature of state and then like its relation to the society. Before we go to that things, I'll briefly explain about the historical context. Like Burma gained independence by means of basically massive popular resistance and the political negotiation with the British. And students and monks played a significant role during the independent movement. Then we got independence. Independence started with the Civil War because of the Communist Party, and then current ethnic minority took up arms against the central government. So even though the insurgency in the central Burma died down in the 1970s, the armed struggle has become the order of the day in the ethnic minority area. And at the same time, as I said, we have the underground, the UG repertoire, very dominant in Burmese politics. So even up to now, like when I was in Burma in '88, I was a high school student. I was involved in the underground network. We organized, we mobilized the student-led protest that led to the 88 nationwide uprising. So the underground movement has hugely contributed to the emergence of 88 movement. So even the legally standing political parties, because of restrictions and regulation, if they want to do effective work, they have to combine underground means of engagement. They cannot rely only on the legal means. They have to combine cleverly with the underground means of engagement. So since 88, I would say the dominant the forms of struggle are basically a mixture of the political legal means and then underground politics and above ground, like most NGO type, like civil society type engagement and media, and also international advocacies. The armed struggle seemed to be pretty much contained because of the ceasefire agreement between military and then the ethnic insurgent groups. So, but interestingly, the international advocacy, the lobby, grassroots campaign, and foreign media have been unprecedentedly stronger, partly because of the increasing number of exile community. So then we'll talk about the nature of state. The Mary already like mentioned a lot about how the military operate and their structure. So I will go very briefly. I mean, basically, their state building goals, what I understood, was like three things. Military really thinks they are entitled. Whenever you talk to your fellow, some military family members or like the top military officers, they always feel they are entitled to run the country. So the sense of entitlement, in a way, like the kind of military supremacy, is very much embedded in their thinking. And the second one is a Burman Buddhist domination. I can give you so many evidence why I say each of these things. And the third one is probably they really occupy with the sense that they need to prepare to fight against the foreign invasion or like invasion by proxy from Thailand or from Bangladesh even. So these are the three state building goals. That's what I try to summarize the way that they think. And then they use coercion, containment, and co-optation to implement these state building goals. So this is the country where we have to very difficult to separate regime, state, and incumbent government, all conflate together. So it's a very conflation of all these stuff, and also their attitude toward opposition is a very much intolerance. When we were in the 88 uprising, they always characterized the 88 uprising and the 2007 Buddhist monks movement as like disorders, anarchy, disturbances, evil and horrifying mob rule. So the lens they see the opposition movement, opposition activities is pretty much like destructive, negative. These groups are going to be eliminated, wiped out, without any negotiation. That's what their view. And also with regard to ethnic minority, the same. They always see the ethnic minority movement as a terrorist, like destroyer of the union. So any opposition against military state building project seem to be you are the enemy of the state. You need to be wiped out, eliminated right away. And also what military in early 90s in the newspaper they run every day, the Tamador run the country with martial law. Martial law means no law at all. So that's the attitude still like going on. Martial law means no law at all. Tamador run the country with the martial law. So within this context, the state building goal and their policy instruments, that really, I would say, make ordinary people to have hostile attitude toward military. That antagonize civil-military relationship. So that's allow opposition great opportunities to rally the public behind them, because people hate when you go to the Burma, when you talk to the ordinary people hate the military. That's a good fuel opportunity for the opposition to rally the public. That's why I said like that nature of state and state-society relation allow the opposition to manage really the public support. And then the other thing is more about I call it the triggers. It messed up because I save in the Mac and now in the PC, so it's a bit messed up. Usually in the Western social movement theory, they talk about a political opportunity structure that's allow the social movement take place, that sustains social movement. The famous like McAdam like 4-dimensional political opportunity. These are like 1, 2, 3, 4 like relative openness and or closure of the institutionalized political system, stability and instability of. So these are the standard the Western social movement theorists look at the any social movement, why it happened, how it's sustained. But to me, I don't see all these these are like 4 dimensions. I don't see the presence of these dimensions in Burma much. I mean, we lack in Burma many of these dimensions. So that's why I'm thinking like probably we may need to look at not political opportunity structure. Probably we should look at more fleeting situational opening. That's what I call like triggers or like strategic opening. For example, like disruption of daily life, like quotidian, or like together with the brutal event, or the prospect of the political realignment within the polity. Let me give you an example. In '88, there was a demonetization. That demonetization really deprived people's daily life, their survival. And that combined with the brutal event, like the killing of the students in the university campus, and like more than 40 students got locked in the police van. They died in the van because of suffocation. That kind of brutal events and that the disruption of daily life, routine, combined together, in Burma case, triggered the public uprising. When you look at the 2007 monks protest, 500% fuel hike, together with the beating of the Buddhist monks, that triggered the public uprising. So whenever we had that, the disruption of quotidian and like an unjust or brutal event came together, in Burma case, likelihood of uprising is quite high. And I want to add one more thing, which is like real or perceived prospect of the possible political realignment changes within the polity. We remember like in '88, General Ne Win, like U Ne Win at that time, announced, I'm going to resign and I'm going to hold the multi-party system. I'm going to shift from the single party to the multi-party. That emboldened public. So whenever the ruling party hints we are going to do something, some kind of political realignment, maybe it's real or like perceived, whatever, that's emboldened the public uprising movement. So in brief, I would say that even right now in 2010, many people inside Burma, their political awareness is getting really higher because of they expect something is going to happen. That's why military is very clever, very cautious not to boost people's confidence. They try to make it like step by step, even they haven't set the date for the election. So they know, they learn the lesson, I would say. So in brief, probably the state, nature of state and its goals and its policy instrument, and together with like the triggering factors, as I said, like one, disruption of the daily life, and just event, and then political realignment. All these things combined together, in this case, that's create the political environment that allow the opposition to manage public support. And in a way, that environment push the public to look for someone who can, represent them, someone who can, walk on behalf of their interests. So on this side, the contextual setting is a very favorable to the opposition legitimacy. I would say that's why in terms of public support, in terms of public support, the opposition is quite relevant. What about like, let's say post-2010? In post-2010, even though military is going to hold the election, and I'll try to look at like from 3 perspectives. One is in terms of goals and relation between military and opposition, whether they're going to be compatible or remain incompatible after election. And the second one is the key issues like human rights violation, like political prisoners, and, forced relocation, forced labor, and corruption, economic mismanagement, and the governance style. So I'm always look at like from three ways. When you use these 3 criteria to look at the post-2010 political environment, things seem to be like quite bleak, not much promising. So in terms of the goals and relation between military and the opposition will remain almost the same, because military try to impose, not only in terms of process, but also in terms of actual implementation. The Constitution, 2010 elections are very much one-sided. So with this one-sided domination, it will not resolve any incompatible goals and relations. So I don't think the elections and like Constitution will transform the antagonistic civil-military relation. When I talk about opposition, not only NLD, but also the ethnic minority too. And the other thing, like key issues that make the Burma pariah country, such as like human rights violation, corruption, economic mismanagement, all these are associated with the military's unchecked power, unchecked interest, and unchecked behavior. According to the Constitution, Commander-in-Chief will continue administer military affairs independently without having any interference from the civilian bodies. So it means they can deploy whatever they want in terms of deployment, in terms of recruitment, in terms of military business. They can run their own show like right now. So how could you expect all these key issues is going to be resolved in post-2010? And the third one, that interests me a lot, the governance style. I think Burmese military has had experience of running the country like dictatorial way, pure military government, or like single party way like BSPP, like socialist government. But they haven't had experience of hybrid system. This is the first time they try the hybrid system. No matter like how marginal role the civilian will play, but still hybrid. For example, Burmese military, they don't care. They just stopped releasing annual budget since 2001. But after election, they can do that. They have to show some kind of accountability. So that hybrid system, I mean, as Mary already noted, how are they going to arrange in the like regional commander, like the prime minister of the state and region and the regional commander, who's going to play a key role in that region? So there are so many loopholes, there are so many contradictions. I mean, when we talk about the regime, we have like principle and procedure. In terms of principle, military supremacy. But in terms of procedure, if you run like military dictatorship, it's good, compatible. The procedure and principle are compatible. But now, the principle is still like military supremacy, but the procedure is hybrid. How it's going to work it out? We need to wait and see, especially when you have a like two power structure, government and military, it will have a like big trouble. And let me run through. So like this is another issue I want to raise is resilience. As I already mentioned, when I talk about resilience, it's not only about the endurance and commitment and courage, but also like repertoire. In terms of repertoire, I think opposition has a like big trouble because they are not willing to diversify their repertoire. Or perhaps they don't have capacity to diversify their repertoire. I will give you an example about this, which is a recent NLD decision. After NLD leadership decided not to register their political party, but there was a dissent within the NLD, whether like a group of NLD leadership, they want to register as a like separate party. But instead of like allowing or even encouraging those who would like to set a political party to contest 2010, NLD leadership tend to vilify the moderates within the group. So it seems the leadership is not strategically not savvy enough to be aware of the advantages the whole movement could gain by franchising the repertoire. I mean, you can go underground, the other group can go above ground, the other group can remain as a political parties. So the more diverse you are in terms of repertoire, the more effective you are. But it seemed like the current leadership seemed to be more centralizing rather than franchising. So in a way, they tend to put all eggs in one basket, all out offensive or all out retreat, rather than like play in a different role. So their response have been highly, sometimes I think like it's more than NLD leadership independent choice. It's maybe like about the political culture of Burma. We need to think about this too, like how they were brought up in terms of like culture, environment, and values, and also the illiberal environment strengthened these value-loaded, principle-centric culture norm. And to be fair, I would like to caution too, even NLD leadership was strategically savvy, or they allow their like descending group to form the political parties. I'm not sure military will let them to register. Look at the Kachin, KIO, the Kachin Ceasefire Group try to have their own proxy political party, but military junta still hasn't allowed them to register. So it's a very tough situation. And another element in the resilience factors, I would say, will be mobilizing structure. I will give credit to Aung San Suu Kyi and the 88 generation group, because when Aung San Suu Kyi was free, whenever she is free, she's always tried to travel to the province area and try to empower local activists and NLD member. Actually, she was the one who encouraged youth leaders of her party to set up volunteer groups to protect the forced labor, to work on the human rights issue, to work on the HIV/AIDS issue. So that's why you now see like Susu Nwe, Psipchu Deng, all these people are like former NLD people. They are the one who been empowered by Aung San Suu Kyi during her trip to the province area. And also the 88 generation, when they was released, Minko 9 and other, they were released in 2004. What they did was they tried to organize in more like network-based rather than hierarchical. So that's give them like very connective tissue. That's eventually lead to the 2007 the Buddhist monk protest. But the problem is, even though when you have that good repertoires or the mobilizing structure, that's what 88 generation did. But if you don't have enough leverage, and you have trouble too. What happened with the Burmese democracy movement, the opposition movement, is they relied too much on the protest and confrontation, rather than to work on non-cooperation technique to try to deprive pillar of support for the military government. So that's another way they lack tactical innovation. That's also related to who lead the movement. The leading agencies are students and monks. So they don't have much leverage when you compare with the workers, government servants, or peasants. So in Burma, the thing is students and monks play a significant role, and there is no group that managed to link students and monks with the workers and peasants, those who can play a key role in depriving military pillar of supports. And then I will go to the other one, the role of third party. When we were inside Burma, we studied a lot about Gene Sharp nonviolent theory. He basically explained about how cooperations and obedience of the people are important to remove the government and to prop up the government. If you withdraw cooperation and obedience of the people, the government will be collapsed. That's what his theory. But in Burma case, the issue is China. Let's say the source of power is not necessarily within the society. The source of power sometimes comes from the outside society. Even though the whole country took to the street, staged protests, China kept selling the arm, kept protecting Burma in the Security Council. There's not much leverage we could do. So the role of third party, it should be very given a serious consideration. And the other one is media accessibility. I would say as you all know, the Burmese language radio station plays a significant role in '88 and in 2007. Now we have increasing coverage of foreign media and bloggers. So these are the as I wrap up first resilience, leverage, and in the leverage we have these elements, and the last one is like framing. Burmese democracy movement usually frame in terms of lost frame. I would say like the idea of lost frame means when you have the fuel hike, when you have like demonetization, the issue is people are losing their daily survival means. So a position like frame the cause in terms of like loss of the people, and that can draw more attention. And in terms of like injustice frame, also like, it's a very effective way. And also like a position have like proposed solution, as I lay out here. So let me go quick the end game strategy. As I said, the failure to fill the power vacuum or add an opponent's indecisiveness took place in '88. In '88, like the opposition movement took to the street calling for the interim government all the time, but they could not actually fill the power vacuum. When the former Prime Minister Unu called like the set up the parallel government, opposition leadership were indecisive whether they should support or not. So the idea is when you have a like massive uprising, but it always ended up in a rhetoric. Because opposition try very hard to achieve the uprising, but they treat the uprising as an end in itself. Actually, the uprising should be mean to achieve something, but they never lay out what they really want to accomplish. So in a way, they fail to identify the broader interests. Instead, they focus too much on the like principle-centric approach. You know, for example, in 2007, the opposition activists they give interview to the radio station. So even the government, military government themselves, learn what opposition think through the media. There is no communication channel between oppositions and the government. There is no third party to play a role to bridge what opposition think and like what government is worried. So the only thing is they only learn through the foreign radio stations' narrative. Most of them are pretty much radical and pretty much rhetorical. So that's why in terms of endgame strategy, they don't have much leverage. So I will end. In terms of outcome, opposition performance is quite miserable. It's not encouraging enough. That's why NLD, Nationally for Democracy, in early April, they themselves admitted, we apologize, Burmese people, for our failure in achieving democracy. That's what the NLD admitted. So, but I rather try to like disaggregate rather than like saying, oh, we fail. I just want to say that we need to disaggregate by looking at all these factors. So, as I said, as a balance sheet, in terms of public support and legitimacy, opposition will remain relevant since all these contextual setting environments will remain persisting. And also in terms of accomplishing goal, I think relevancy is not that strong. But when we look at this disaggregating as a like final thought, I think diversification of repertoires should be what opposition thinks seriously. Instead of like putting all eggs in one basket, they should diversify their repertoires. Like some of them should go underground, some of them should go above ground, some of them should set up political parties. So as much as you could diversify, the chance of being relevant is very high. And the other one is like tactical innovation. As I said, they should rely on like non-cooperation things and broadening the leading agencies and also the third-party intervention. They should work more on the China, ASEAN, other regional powers to get involved more in Burma case. And last, probably, they should really think in terms of interest rather than righteousness. I mean, we all, no doubt, the how sacrifice, how committed they are, how courageous they are. But they need to think also in terms of interest. What is their interest? For example, like how to maximize civilian participation in transition. Anyway, maybe election or uprising, whatever. Broadly, they everything broadly rather than like narrowing or like too much hardening themselves. So as a conclusion, I would say like they're going to continue be relevant in public support and legitimacy, but they need to work very hard and smart on resilience, leverage, endgame strategy to make themselves relevant in completion their professed goal. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now going to open up the floor to our first Q&A session. So here are some ground rules. Please raise your hand and wait for the mic to come to you, and please identify your name and affiliation. Well, actually, I'm just going to go ahead and venture with the first couple of questions. One question for Mary. Just wondering should Ta Shui be, in any case, disabled, is there a political succession plan in place? And one question for minsin. After the disbandment of the NLD, once the new party is formed out of the remnants of the NLD, do you foresee any major changes or differences between the NLD and the new party?
Do we answer? No. I think Than Shui will not live forever. His death has been much over-predicted, however. Stories from Singaporean doctors who said he was going to die in 2003, unfortunately, not true. Is there a political succession plan in place? Well, we have a big 13-year data point out there, which is the National Convention to produce the Constitution, 2008 Constitution. We read that as a map of political succession, or at least a constitutional framework for Than Shui's family to be for their financial interests, their freedom to be protected when he is no longer in charge or no longer around. Possibly that's the political succession plan, but again, we don't know. Who knows what's going on in Naypyidaw? I mean, this regime was highly secret and inaccessible when it was based in Rangoon, back when, Mao A and Kinyon and others played golf, at least, with foreigners, so or with civilian business people or whatever. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a political succession plan in place, but I am pretty darn sure that we're not going to see a major power vacuum. Thanks.
Well, as in my presentation, I often mention about the political culture. I'm kind of like sick to blame everything on the political culture issue. It's very cheap, but it's true in Burmese context. I mean, these new like NLD remnant, if they want to gain the public support, they have to figure out some way to get concession from the NLD like existing party leadership. Otherwise, the problem is like many foreigners, they are not aware what's going on in the like Burmese language media, Burmese language brokers. I mean, to what extent they are being vilified. Mm-hmm. So I'm not supporting them or I'm not against them. But my point is, if you want to make it work, you have to have political capital, some sort of support from existing party leadership, Dawn San Suu Kyi, U Win Din, all these people. Otherwise, they will be popular among the foreigners, like some like thoughtfuls or whatever. I mean, they are very popular among the foreigners, but among the ordinary public, these people receive their information from radio station, from BBC, VOA, RFA. It's very difficult. That's why I think opposition need to really identify what their interest is rather than what right is all the time. So unless we get that, I doubt their effectiveness.
Great, thanks. All right, lady on the right.
Hi, I'm Frances Winnig, U.S. ASEAN Business Council. For both of you, what is your analysis of how much attention both SPDC and the opposition groups play to the outside? For example, what if any difference is what has just happened or is happening in Thailand make in terms of the situation in Myanmar?
You know what? I think I'm going to be answering every question. I don't know. We do have clear evidence if we look at speeches, et cetera, of the generals over the last 10 years or so, especially in the last few years. You look at the government mouthpiece media, and you see these attacks on forces outside of the country, whether they're related to Burma or not. But I would say that they were sitting in Naypyidaw and just having a ball throughout the Thai mess. I mean, historically, the Tomato has never had any respect whatsoever for the Thai military. If you go to the Armed Forces Defense and Armed Forces Museum in Rangoon, there's a little section on the Thai military, and it basically says in Burmese, not translated into English, that the only people the Thai military ever kill in operations are themselves. So, but connected to that, I would also point out that in 2006, when the military coup occurred against Thaksin Shinawatra, and maybe this moves into, I'm moving on to your territory, Minsin, but there were many in the opposition who hated Thaksin, and I mean the Burmese pro-democracy campaign groups that hated Thaksin and found themselves stretching all over the place to justify a military coup. There was a lot of talk of what would have happened if Burma had had a king, if there had been a countervailing force to the military. And I have to say that right now, I think you're better off without a king because of the succession crisis that Thailand is facing. I mean, the very fact that the prince himself has developed his own faction of the Thai military, which is well-armed and dangerous, is a suggestion that, countervailing forces, I mean, I guess it's a be careful what you wish for, so.
A quick note, interestingly, I had a chance to read the meeting minutes of the top military meeting in 2005, 2006. At the time, the regional commander debriefed what he learned from the quarterly meeting to the senior members. And he said in that meeting minutes, well, the senior general Tan-Sri designated Thailand as an instability zone. So I was so, wow, okay. At the time, I was in radio station. I chopped some part of this, and I think I broadcasted it. It was like, oh, what's going on in Thailand? Thailand is quite stable at the time. But right after that, there was a southern insurgency, and then now what's going on in Thailand. So many regional commanders and top military officers, see, our guys are so smart. Our general, these guys, see, they have very limited exposure in their life. So they look at him as a god, wow, this guy's prediction turned out to be true. So interesting.
Front row on the left.
Yvonne Ying, consultant with the World Bank. I have two questions. One is for Min Z. So why you say the uprising in the past always is led by the student or the monk, and never led by the workers, farmers, or civilians? Although they participate, but they never become the leader of the uprising. Why? This is the first question. Second question, maybe for both of you, is about the military power structure within the military. So first, how these military people come from? That means they always come from the military elite family, or they actually from a very broad social different families. Who would like to become military, and then maybe they have an opportunity to become a leader? And then within the military, so their structure is when the people in the super position, they are dictator everything. And if it is the case, what kind of instrument they use to make everyone can listen to him? He can become dictator within the military. If this is not the case, then is there different department or factions, whatever they have the so-called maybe I can say the power check or balance or whatever they can be do something like the procedure of the consultative, whatever kind of things they make.
Structurally speaking, Burma is an agricultural society, so we do not have much workforce. Like industrialized society, we don't have much worker force. So as you know, farmers are spread around, so they could not play leading role in the urban-based uprising. This is structurally speaking. Culturally speaking, I would say we have a saying, we call it in Burmese, "Ta Tung Ta," it's 3 cents. The idea is a sense of Lord, Buddha, the monks, or sense of school, meaning students, sense of military, soldiers. These three forces are agents of reform in Burma. When you go down to Burma, everybody knows, like, oh, da don't da, like 3 cents. So that's cultural, I think, frame also influence a lot. People expect students or monks to play leading role.
Do you want me to answer the military
please.
structure real quickly? Mao Myo has actually written a very extensive book on the changing nature of the command structure in Burma that has allowed for high centralization, a high degree of centralization. It's very complicated and has gone on for a very long time. But one thing I would say is that the Burmese military, with one exception over the last 50 years, does not face a lot of juniors, officers or rank and files questioning commands. So it probably has a lot to do with military education, but it also has to do with a very rigid and successful command structure. Where does the Burmese military come from? Senior leadership, primarily from rural areas. However, the military undertook a massive expansion in the early 1990s. The officer corps had to expand to accommodate a doubling in the size of the military. And so the officers who are around the lieutenant colonel rank at this point are officers who came on board in the 90s. I am not sure, but I would guess there's a lot more urban representation in the officer corps, the junior officer corps. Whether they stay in the military or not remains to be seen. As I mentioned, the strength of the Army is much lower than it is on paper. And we're now getting to actually a Thai Army scenario where those who get their first stars as generals there may not be enough jobs for them in the military. Jim Oakey found about 10 years ago in one of Mathayo's publications that a third of the Thai generals actually had no assignment. And then one last thing, which is that Andrew South reports that the massive expansion of higher education in the military, the Defense Services Institute of Technology, nursing school, medical school, et cetera, he says that they have the capacity to graduate 3,000 new commissioned officers every year. I spent some time in Maemyo 2 years ago, which is where most of these education institutions are. And there's not a lot of activity, so I'm not sure. I guess I would just say that we have a few data points that actually kind of contradict each other, so I'd say it's an open question.
The gentleman in green, and then Lex.
Yes, my name is Lee Irwin. I'm from the Louisiana State University in Shreveport. My question is that I would wonder if y'all would express any concern over the ideas that there might be a power vacuum if the leader were to pass away. I know you already spoke about the secession, but it's kind of like what she said, Ms. Callahan said about the be careful what you wish for, as we see in Iraq right now. So if you could please just discuss what a power vacuum would look like and what the United States or regional powers could do to ensure that there wouldn't be even worse things coming in than what we have with the junta. Thank you.
I'm Lex Riefau with the Brookings Institution. I would like to hear what both of the speakers have to say about U.S. policy today, and how the U.S. government is reacting to the elections, and what adjustments each of them would suggest to make U.S. policy more effective. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and say that David Steinberg is going to cover that issue in the next hour.
Okay, on the question of a power vacuum, I don't see a power vacuum happening. Again, there have been times in history when there should have been power vacuums. And this is not a military on the brink at all. So I really don't see that happening. The military grafted itself onto the skeletal remains of the socialist state in 1988. and most of both administrative and political positions were militarized. But, that has actually changed quite a bit. It's been several years since, for example, the General Administration Department required most township-level officers and up to be civilians. And we don't actually know how that is playing out. It may be empowering civilians, or it may be putting totally figurehead civilians in positions where they get bossed around by local commanders. I'm not sure. But I really don't see a power vacuum. In terms of U.S. policy, I think U.S. has no choice but to question and criticize the election laws and the Constitution, much as the U.S. in the past should have criticized many of the Thai constitutions. Like, for example, why is it that a representative of a constituency in a legislature had to have a bachelor's degree in an overwhelming, even from overwhelmingly rural areas? That strikes me as an anti-democratic feature, and there are massive numbers of anti-democratic features in the SPDC approach to transformation. I don't know what is honestly going on in U.S. policy. I think it's very difficult. It's got to be very difficult for the U.S. to find anybody to really talk to in Naypyidaw. The threat to your career of being viewed as pro-U.S. is got to be overwhelming after 22 years. What I would love to see is for the U.S. to go and pour humanitarian aid into the ethnic nationality areas. These are places that concluded ceasefires as many as 21 years ago because these ceasefires, some Burman political leaders called them illegitimate because they were agreements with the SLORC and now SPDC. Humanitarian aid only came in cross borders. And so populations that came out of 2 decades of war had nothing. 2 decades to 5 decades, actually, really had no support from most of the major aid donors. My view is that you get humanitarian aid in there in some way that works the system. Endurance is remarkably important force in Burma. So that would be my only recommendation.
Very quick note. Everybody, even opposition movement in Burma, they welcome the new engagement policy. But there seem to be two components. After Senator Jim Webb visit to Burma, and he wrote articles in the New York Times too. And what happened was, I learned from one of the inside sources what Dan Shui, after Jim Webb visit, what he said. He seemed to be very confident. He said, now, I don't need anybody. Everybody need me. India need me to balance against China and counterinsurgency along the border. ASEAN need me for trade and others. And China need me for energy and then sea exit. And now United States need me to contain China. So the issue is very important, When I was in China, many Chinese scholars and officials, they asked me, what about new policy? I said and they always think, they take it for granted what Senator Webb said to contain China. I said, I'm not sure whether this represents the establishment policy, because if you approach Burma to contain China, it will not be successful. And also, it will definitely send wrong signal to China. So if you want to engage Burma to contain China, this is wrong from the beginning. They will definitely allow military to gain more leverage to play one against another. So that's we need to be cautious.
I'm afraid we're running out of time for the Q&A, but we will have another Q&A after our next two speakers have spoken. So please bear with us as we switch, as we get ready for our next panel. And this is also an opportunity for you to stretch your legs.